morning. We're at the entrance to Sweetwater Wetlands. This is one of Arizona's historic habitats that I wanted to show you. This wetland, Sweetwater, is actually artificial, but it's a pretty good replica of what wetlands in the Tucson area used to look like. And despite its artificiality, it attracts lots of wildlife, including a lot of migratory birds, as well as reptiles and mammals. It's also highly attractive to bird watchers. This is probably the most bird-watched area in greater Tucson. We'll talk a little bit about the dynamics of an artificial wetland and also the natural functions of this wetland as we walk through. Alright, so let's take a quick look at this little feeder channel into Sweetwater Wetlands. You can see some of the plants we'll be looking at more closely, and in a minute we're going to check out some mosquito fish in this little channel itself. Here we're looking at the little artificial stream that helps direct water through the Sweetwater Wetlands. There's kind of a net or overall flow in one direction, so all water eventually passes through the wetlands. The little fish in here are mosquito fish, Gambusia, and they are close relatives of the native top minnow, which has largely been eliminated from the area. Top minnow are just as good at mosquito control as these mosquito fish, but people thought, well, maybe they're better, and they're from somewhere else, so they got to be better. So they were introduced, and because they're a little bit bigger and a little bit more aggressive, they've displaced the native species. So, what is a wetland? Well, you could just take it literally as a wet land. A wetland is a place where water either accumulates or moves kind of slowly through a system. Many wetlands are associated with rivers, so as a river might divert into a much more shallow area where plants can grow, like some of the ones behind me, you start developing a marsh or a swamp. A marsh is basically grassy. A swamp tends to have a lot of trees in it. Here we have a little bit of both. But marshes and swamps and wetlands are very significant habitats, because what happens is, as these plants grow and as water slows, so as the water slows, it starts to release sediments. So things that the river would carry for a distance start to drop out, and then plants grow, their leaves die, those go down in, and you end up with this very rich muck. One of the drawbacks to some marshes is that that muck, although it's very rich in nutrients, tends to be oxygen poor. But the combination of vegetation and water is extremely attractive to wildlife. And so these are some of the richest sites for various kinds of organisms, plants, insects, birds, mammals, that you're likely to happen across. Sweetwater is probably the most actively birded site in the Tucson area, and often very unexpected species show up here. So it's a rich region. So for all the outward appearances of this wetland gives you a sense of what wetlands looked like hundreds, if not thousands of years ago, Sweetwater is a managed wetland, and that's because it's associated with water treatment. And what happens is that filtered water is released into settlement ponds where even smaller particulates settle out, gives the plants and the bacteria a chance to do their work. And then sometimes you can't even see the movement, but the water proceeds slowly through this system, and at the right time it's then moved to recharge basins, which are within sight of here, but between this marsh and the Santa Cruz riverbed over there. From there, the water is allowed to sink into the ground, and then as needed it can be pumped back up, chlorinated, and typically used for irrigation. So this area is perfectly safe to walk around in, but don't let your dog drink the water or play in it, and heaven forbid don't do any snorkeling. This region now is kind of shifting a bit more towards a park for nature lovers, because a newer facility, much larger, more state-of-the-art, up the road is now online. Plants, these aquatic plants help purify water that passes through these settlement ponds at Sweetwater, but bacteria, little microscopic organisms, also has a major role. Now, a lot of the bacteria in this region are adapted to low oxygen environments. So instead of a metabolism that's oxygen-based like ours, their metabolisms are instead sulfate-based. Just as we produce a waste gas, carbon dioxide, bacteria do too, except it happens to be hydrogen sulfate. And if you're walking along a nice, organically clean beach mudflat at low tide, and your foot sinks deep into the mud and you suck it out, you pull your foot out, and it smells like raw sewage. Well, that's not because it's sewage, it's because also in some mud marshes, marine mud marshes, these same kinds of bacteria are there, and you're smelling their waste gas. But the important thing to remember is these organisms have a very significant role in removing various substances from water, including wastewater. One of the things about marshes with lots of crowded vegetation is it's very attractive to mosquitoes and mosquito larvae. Pima County manages this wetland for mosquito control. They monitor weekly for mosquitoes and will do some organic treatments like the application of a bacteria that specifically attacks mosquito larvae. And usually every March they burn away a lot of this vegetation, and the idea is to eliminate some of the shelters that mosquito larvae can use to evade fish and other organisms that live in this water. So it's another aspect of management associated with this wetland. One of the phenomena you can see pretty clearly in a wetland is the concept of zonation. And this is widespread in nature. You see it often among plants, but you can also see it among shoreline organisms, with the most drought tolerant or dry tolerant at the very closest to the top of the beach, and the ones that require more water closer to permanent or consistent water. But here we're going to look at a few plants and see where they are in this zonation pattern. So on our list we have blue Palo Verde, cattail, duckweed, saltbush, cottonwood, Goodings willow, mesquite, and a couple of bulrush species. And what you should be thinking about as we proceed through Sweetwater is, I'll talk about where each one is located in relation to water. And you'll get a sense of how these plants have strict limits, strict upper and lower limits as to how much or how little water they can tolerate. And that will determine where they can grow if a seed lands in a particular area. Here we're looking at the surface of the water at Sweetwater Wetlands, and you'll notice if I stir it, what I'm doing here is disrupting the duckweed plants that float on the surface. And in the right light, the entire surface of the water looks green, and that's because of the gazillions of duckweed floating at the surface. These plants are very simple in appearance. They have two or a pair of tiny little leaves, little green leaves that have oil in them that helps the plant float. And then descending from the two leaves is a single white root. And I'm going to pick up some on this cattail stem so we can get a closer look at them. Okay, here we have a slightly closer look at this stuff, and it's a simple little plant, and this is a bunch of them, but basically it's a couple of paired leaves with a single thread-like root dangling below into the water. And there's a little bit of oil within the leaves that helps these plants float on the surface. And that's why they can cover the surface as they do. So here are a couple more plants that show pronounced zonation in relation to water. We have two species of bulrush here, this little shorter kind of yellowish one right here. But you can see it goes only from the extreme water's edge right here to a relatively short depth here. And then it's replaced by yet another species of bulrush. So back there is a little bit too much water for this species, maybe a little too dry for this second larger species. If we look beyond, we can see some plants that are starting to brown at the tips, and those are cattails. These dry back or die back, turn brown in the winter, and they're already starting to do that. Cattails can live in water that's about 1 meter deep, but no deeper. So you can almost assess water depth, or the maximum water depth you might be looking at, by looking at these cattails. And a little bit further on, I'm going to talk about cattails in some more detail, and talk about how they live in completely submerged in water, or emergent from that much water. Okay, so I'm standing in front of some cattails, and they're named that because the fruits, I guess, look like cattails to somebody. This stuff, I'm going to try and break this guy open a bit. It's kind of not terribly ripe. It isn't, but if you do break it open, you start getting fluff. And a little bit later on, the roadways will be almost covered with this stuff. So the seeds disperse because of these little filaments that make them a little bit airborne. And that's how these plants spread. Now, as I've said, these plants can live in up to 3 feet of water. And that presents a different problem for plants, because plants that are entirely in water are challenged to get oxygen to their roots. So you've probably been like me, and at some point or another you overwatered a plant and killed it, a potted plant or something. And what happens is, in a situation like that, the roots start to die, and then they start to rot, and the rest of the plant is gone. What these plants do, and if you feel one of these leaves, they feel a little bit yielding, but they have channels, basically snorkel tubes, that run the length of the leaf. So as they bring in air through the leaves, they can kind of direct it down to their roots, and that's how they keep their roots oxygenated. Okay, so I have another cattail here that I've pulled some of the fluff out of, and now I'm going to cut this cattail leaf open along its length to show you air channels. Okay. So if we turn this over and take a look at it, you can see that it's mostly air in here. If you pick up a cattail leaf and press it like that, you're going to be able to crush it. And that's because of this network of air channels that allows air exchange between the leaf, which brings it in, down to the roots, and oxygen can also leave through the root surface. This enables cattail and other plants like some of the bulrushes we looked at to exist with their roots completely submerged in water, in some cases 100% of the time. Most plants, and you know this if you've overwatered a plant or something, if they get too much water, the roots rot and the plant will die. But these guys have this trick, and this enables plants like this to have a near worldwide distribution because they do what many other plants can't do. This is one of our zonation plants. This is a young Fremont Cottonwood. A large one can have a diameter of about 4 feet. So these trees can get very large. They're typically found very close to the water's edge, and that's because they have an enormous need for water. This is not a desert-adapted plant. A large one, like the one I described before, can require 300 gallons of water a day for basic metabolic operations. To distinguish this from other trees, look for pale, relatively pale, slightly grooved bark, and the leaves are kind of heart or fan shaped. We'll show you a close-up in a little bit. And these big leaves also account for this plant's substantial need for water. Cottonwoods are disappearing in our landscapes because of their high need for water, and because river habitats and wetland habitats are under threat throughout southern Arizona. This is another one of Arizona's large trees. This is a Goodings Willow, and you can distinguish it from Fremont Cottonwood by the usually somewhat darker and more rugged looking bark, and also by the leaves, which are long and skinny. Botanists call this a lanceolate leaf. It is a true willow. Not all willows weep. This one doesn't really, but it's found in Arizona and other southwestern areas, and is found at the water's edge because, again, it needs a lot of water. This tree is a velvet mesquite, and unlike the other two big trees, Fremont Cottonwood and Goodings Willow, it has pinnately compound leaves, as we've talked about previously, and fairly dark, kind of rugged or corrugated looking bark, especially on the large stems. This plant is kind of a desert edge plant. If it gets close to water, as this one is, even though the water's out of sight, they can get very large. If they're in much drier locations, they tend to be smaller. One thing about all trees is that if you look at a tree, you can assume that the extent of the roots is about the same as the extent of the crown of the tree. So this plant may have some root tips right at the water's edge, even though it's quite a distance away, and mesquites have huge tap roots, so they may be collecting groundwater below the soil. So this is a very flexible tree in terms of how it does in different environments. This plant we've met before. This is a blue Palo Verde, and it is, for your table today, I classify it as desert edge. It's commonly found near large washes that might flow often with a pretty good volume, but it's not necessarily near permanent water. So this one happens to be pretty close and is nice and big and healthy because of it, but they are a little bit more tolerant of dryness than this one needs to be. This is one of the plants on your table in your worksheet. This is a four-winged saltbush, and it's usually found at the edge of the desert, as we approach a wetland system. And it's called that because of the wing structure on the seed pods, which I've kind of got in my hands here. Saltbush is aptly named because it does well in environments that have a little bit of added salt to soil systems. Rivers like the Salt River and many other desert rivers have a slightly higher amount of salt in them than you'd expect to see in a freshwater system. And for plants, this is a big deal because if soil is too salty, then it's hard, or for some species, impossible for the plant to grow. So what saltbush does, and there's a couple of species here, is it has glands on the surface of the leaf that as water comes up through the stem, brought up from the roots, the leaves basically kick the salt out onto the surface so that salt doesn't accumulate within the plant. And for saltbush, you can diagnose by tasting. They usually have a slightly salty taste to them. And you can also look at them and see in sunlight a little bit of glisten from the salt crystals, tiny salt crystals on the surface of the leaf. So this concludes our visit to Sweetwater Wetlands. I hope you got a sense of how wetlands work, how they can purify water. I hope you got a sense of the way plants are arranged in essentially different zones in relation to how near they need to be to water. Sweetwater Wetlands is visited by a lot of people, and admission here is free. It's located at 2511 West Sweetwater Boulevard, and it's open dawn to dusk. And also, I'd like to thank Angie and Jill, our camera people, for taking the time to shoot all these videos.